Thank you so much, Jonathan. That was wonderful. Well, hi everyone. Welcome to the final metamorphosis of the semester. I'm Stefan, and I'm the co-hosting with Jonathan. And today we have the honor and the great privilege of welcoming Swami Medhananda, who will be speaking tonight. Swami Medhananda is a monk of the Ramakrishna Order and Senior Research Fellow in Philosophy at the Vedanta Society of Southern California in Hollywood. He also serves as Hindu Religious Director at the University of Southern California and as Section Editor for the International Journal of Hindu Studies at Springer, overseeing submissions in Hindu and cross-cultural philosophy of religion. From 2010 to 2021, he was Associate Professor and Head of the Program in Philosophy at the Ramakrishna Mission, Vivekananda Educational and Research Institute in Balurmat, West Bengal. His current research focuses on global philosophy of religion, cosmopolitan approaches to consciousness, Indian scriptural hermeneutics, and Vedantic philosophical traditions, especially the philosophies of Sri Ramakrishna, Swami Vivekananda, and Sri Aurobindo. Among his publications are the most current one, Swami Vivekananda's Vedantic Cosmopolitanism, published by Oxford, 2022. Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality, Sri Ramakrishna and Cross-Cultural Philosophy of Religion, also from Oxford, 2018. And The Dialectics of Aesthetic Agency, Reevaluating German Aesthetics from Kant to Adorno, published by Bloomsbury in 2013. So, Swami, welcome.
Thank you so much, Stefan, and thank you, Jonathan, for that lovely, really sublime performance. It feels like an anticlimax now to give a dry academic talk, but that's what fate ordains. So let me share my screen. Can everyone see the PowerPoint? Great. All right, so as Stefan just mentioned, my previous book was called Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality, Sri Ramakrishna and Cross-Cultural Philosophy of Religion. And so this talk is going to be based primarily on chapter 3 of that book. And I'll just briefly gesture in the last couple slides to toward sort of the influence of Sri Ramakrishna on Sri Aurobindo. And then I'd like, maybe hear from you guys who probably know a lot more about Sri Aurobindo than I do, about resonances maybe between the two mystics. So Sri Ramakrishna, many of you are probably aware, born in 1836, left his body in 1886. He was a Bengali mystic and yogi. And he's well known, especially for having practiced spiritual disciplines in a number of different religious traditions, including Tantra, Vaishnavism, Advaita Vedanta, Islam, and Christianity. And he had various kinds of spiritual experiences through those practices. Some of them were theistic and others were non-theistic. And on the basis of his varied religious disciplines and spiritual experiences, he affirmed the harmony of all religions. He formulated the harmony of religions in many different ways. One of his most famous statements is, "As many fades, so many paths." Moth Poth in Bengali. Now, before we go any further, I thought it's useful to bring in a conceptual framework introduced by the Christian theologian Alan Race in the early 80s. He distinguished 3 paradigms for understanding the relationship among the different world religions. And this typology has become extremely influential. And I think some people argue that these categories aren't helpful, but I think they are, especially in the context of understanding Ramakrishna's views in contrast to other views on the relationship among the world religions. So exclusivism is the view that only one religion leads to salvation, while all other religions fail to lead to salvation. An example would be the Protestant theologian Karl Barth. Inclusivism is the view that only one religion leads directly to salvation, but other religions lead indirectly to salvation or afford lesser forms of salvation. My religion is the best or the highest. Other religions are not completely wrong. They're not hopeless, but they're lower than mine in some respect. Examples of an inclusivist position include the Catholic theologian Karl Rahner, and on the Indian side, Advaita Vedanta. At least I'm going to argue Advaita Vedanta, at least in its classical form, as embodied in Shankara's philosophy and as developed by more modern Advaitins like Sarvepalli Radhakrishnan and T.M.P. Mahadevan. And the third paradigm is religious pluralism. This is the view that multiple religions can equally lead to salvation. Instead of having higher and lower, they're in equal position to lead you to the same goal of salvation. Examples of religious pluralists on the Western side include John Hick and Paul Knitter. And on the Indian side, I would say that Sri Ramakrishna deserves to be considered a really robust religious pluralist and a distinctive kind of religious pluralist. Now, I want to highlight what's really unique and valuable and relevant to contemporary times in Sri Ramakrishna's doctrine of religious pluralism. Oh, the other thing I wanted to mention is that these are just my provisional definitions of the terms. These are not taken directly from Alan Race's book. Different scholars have defined these terms in different ways, in subtly different ways. And so I'm just laying it out here. Here's how I understand the terms for the purposes of this presentation. Okay, so first, as a kind of contrastive, to set into relief Ramakrishna's views on the harmony religions, I think it's useful to think of Shankara's Advaita Vedanta first. So Shankara's philosophy of Advaita Vedanta is often captured in the classic formula in Sanskrit, Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya, Jivo Brahmeva Naparaha. Brahman alone is real, the world is unreal. The individual is none other than Brahman. The individual soul is none other than Brahman. So Shankara taught 5 main doctrines. 1, the soul reality is Brahman, which is understood as non-dual pure consciousness, strictly impersonal. 2, the world, the personal God, Ishvara, and individual souls, jivas, are all empirically real. They're real from the Vyavaharika standpoint, but ultimately non-existent. Non-existent from the Paramatika standpoint. 3, we attain liberation, moksha, by attaining knowledge of our true nature as Brahman. 4, Jnana Yoga, the yoga of knowledge, is the only direct path to liberation. And 5, Bhakti Yoga, the yoga of devotion, and Karma Yoga, the yoga of unselfish works, lead indirectly to liberation by purifying and concentrating the mind, thereby making us eligible to practice Jnana Yoga. Okay, I guess I was a little bit fat, but I assume some of you are already familiar with classical Advaita Vedanta. And in any case, this is just a kind of contracted framework. So let me just, in the form of a diagram, illustrate how I see modern Advaita Vedantins adapting Shankara's metaphysical framework to apply to all of the different world religions. So I'm thinking of modern Advaitins like Sarvepalli Radhakrishnan and T.M.P. Mahadevan. So they harmonize the world religions roughly along the following lines. They say, for instance, that Christians, through the practice of Christianity, can attain the realization of the Christian God. Likewise, Muslims, through the practice of Islam, can realize God in the form of Allah. Theistic Hindus can, through their respective Hindu traditions, realize some particular form of the personal God. But the catch is that this is not the highest realization. This is just the realization of various forms of the personal God, called in classical Advaita Saguna Brahman, Brahman with attributes, which is not sufficient for moksha, for liberation from transmigratory existence. And so ultimately Christians have to stop the practice of Christianity and then practice Jnana Yoga, the Advaitic path of Jnana Yoga, and then they can realize the highest goal of life, which is realization of your true nature as non-dual Brahman. Likewise for Muslims, likewise for theistic Hindus. And these are just examples. You can, multiply examples of Judaism and other religions as well. So now, keep that in mind, please, as we move forward. So now we can start discussing Sri Ramakrishna's views on the harmony of religions and how they're distinct from classical Advaita. So Ramakrishna, in many places in his teachings, as recorded in the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, that's the English translation of the original Bengali work, Sri Ramakrishna Kathamrita, written by Mahendranath Gupta, a very important householder disciple of Sri Ramakrishna. So Sri Ramakrishna, in many places, distinguishes 2 stages of spiritual experience, which he calls jnana and vijnana. He describes these stages as follows. He says, the jnani gives up his identification with worldly things, discriminating not this, not this. Only then can he realize Brahman. It is like reaching the roof of a house by leaving the steps behind one by one. But the vijnani, who is more intimately acquainted with Brahman, realizes something more. He realizes that the steps are made of the same materials as the roof: bricks, lime, and brick dust. That which is realized as Brahman through the eliminating process of not this, neti neti in Sanskrit, is then found to have become the universe and all its living beings. The Vijnani sees that the reality which is impersonal, nirguna, is also personal, saguna. This is known as Vijnana. So there's a lot to unpack here from a philosophical standpoint. I take the Jnani to be the traditional Advaita Vedantin, a follower of Shankara, who attains spiritual realization of the impersonal non-dual Brahman through the practice of Jnana Yoga. The Vijnani then first attains the state of Jnana and then goes beyond the Advaitic Jnani by realizing that Brahman is not only impersonal, nirguna, but also personal, saguna. So it's the Vijnani goes one step further than the Jnani. So while the Jnani dismisses this universe as a framework of illusion, the Bangla here is dhokatati, the Vijnani embraces the universe as a mansion of mirth, mojarkuti, as a real manifestation of God. So in my previous book, Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality, I dub Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy as Vijnana Vedanta. And for the present purposes, for the purposes of this lecture, I'm just going to mention 3 of the main tenets of Vijnana Vedanta. 1, the sole reality is the infinite divine reality, which is the impersonal non-dual Brahman in one aspect and the personal God Shakti in another aspect. He would often teach Brahma or Shakti Abhed in Bangla, which means the non-dual Brahman and the personal Shakti are inseparable but equally real aspects of the same infinite divine reality. Second tenet, the world and all individual souls are real manifestations of Shakti. And 3, Jnana Yoga, Bhakti Yoga, Karma Yoga, and Raja Yoga, the yoga of meditation, are all direct paths to the goal of God realization. There's no higher and lower, unlike in traditional schools of Vedanta. Now, Ramakrishna's Vijnana-based ontology of the impersonal, personal, infinite reality serves as the basis of his doctrine of religious pluralism. And that comes out very clearly in one of my favorite teachings. He says, God is infinite and the paths to God are infinite. Tini ananto, poto ananto. The reason why I like this teaching is because he explains why there are infinite paths to God. There are infinite paths to God because God himself or herself is infinite. That's why the title of my previous book is Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality, the title of this lecture also. So paths are infinite because God is infinite. And Ramakrishna's parable of the chameleon illustrates the harmony of all religions from the standpoint of Vijnana. So I think it's useful to acquaint ourselves with this parable. Once a man entered a forest and saw a small animal on a tree. He came back and told another man that he had seen a creature of a beautiful red color on a certain tree. The second man replied, when I went into the forest, I also saw that animal. But why do you call it red? It is green. Another man who was present contradicted them both and insisted that it was yellow. Presently, others arrived and contended that it was gray, violet, blue, and so forth and so on. At last, they started quarreling among themselves. To settle the dispute, they all went to the tree. They saw a man sitting under it. On being asked, he replied, yes, I live under this tree and I know the animal very well. All your descriptions are true. Sometimes it appears red, sometimes yellow, and at other times blue, violet, gray, and so forth. It is a chameleon. And sometimes it has no color at all. Now it has a color and now it has none. In like manner, one who constantly thinks of God can know God's real nature. He alone knows that God reveals himself to seekers in various forms and aspects. God is personal as well as impersonal. Only the man who lives under the tree knows that the chameleon can appear in various colors, and he knows further that the animal at times has no color at all. It is the others who suffer from the agony of futile argument. So there are 2 aspects of this parable that I want to bring your attention to. The first is notice that the chameleon sometimes has different colors. These correspond to different forms of the personal God. Okay, so it could be Christ, it could be Krishna, it could be Vishnu, or whoever else. But the chameleon is sometimes colorless. That corresponds to Nirguna Brahman of Advaita Vedanta, the impersonal, attributeless, non-dual Brahman. And notice that just by the very nature of the parable, that there's no higher and lower. It's not, the parable can't be interpreted as saying that somehow the colorless chameleon is truer or greater than any color of the chameleon. So they're all on an equal footing. That's the first thing to keep in mind. The second thing is there's a very unusual person who lives under the tree, who sits there 24/7 and sees the chameleon in various colors and as colorless. This person, this unique person, unlike the people who just occasionally come to a tree for a few minutes or seconds and then go back, this is the Vijnani. This is Ramakrishna's Vijnani, who experiences and realizes God and relishes God in various forms and aspects. Okay, so keep that in mind. So as both personal and impersonal. So now, with that in the background, this is how I would suggest that we diagram Ramakrishna's harmonizing of the world religions in contrast to the classical Advaitic model for harmonizing the world religions, which, this is something I forgot to mention, but which is very important. Remember that Alan Race introduced this typology with 3 terms: exclusivism, inclusivism, and pluralism. So the Advaita diagram should be clear that that's an inclusivistic paradigm, right? Because it's placing its own philosophy at the top of the mountain and saying that other religions can take you sort of part of the way, but it can't take you all the way. Ultimately, you have to give up your lower devotional practices, practice our path, and then alone can you attain the highest goal, which is liberation. So that's an inclusivist paradigm. I want to argue by contrast that Ramakrishna's harmony of religions is a robustly pluralist one. And I see his doctrine more or less as follows. Christians through the path of Christianity can directly realize some aspect or form of the impersonal, personal, infinite reality, which leads directly to salvation. Same goes for Muslims, same goes for Hindus, same goes for Advaita Vedantins, same goes for Buddhists. One can multiply examples, as I mentioned earlier, Judaism, and so on. So you see, there's no higher and lower here. There's no kind of, it doesn't, Sri Ramakrishna does not say that these religious paths can only take you part of the way or in any way inferior to some preferred path. Another distinctive feature of his doctrine of the harmony of religions is that he has a really expansive conception of the state of post-mortem salvation. According to Ramakrishna, there are 2 fundamentally different types of spiritual aspirants: bhaktas, devotionally oriented people who strive to cultivate a loving relationship with the personal God, and jnanis, intellectually oriented people like Advaita Vedantins and Buddhists who strive for nirvana, a salvific state in which no sense of individuality remains. And in contrast to the traditional schools of Vedanta, Ramakrishna grants equal value to both the Advaitic and devotional ideals of salvation. I think this is very distinctive. The form of salvation we choose depends on our individual temperament and preference. While some spiritual aspirants seek to merge their individuality in the impersonal non-dual Brahman, like Advaita Vedantins, arguably some Buddhists, devotees tend to prefer to retain a sense of individuality in order to enjoy the bliss of loving communion with the personal God. And a nice homely metaphor that Sri Ramakrishna uses, which I really like, is devotees prefer to eat sugar, while Advaitins want to become sugar. Both ideals are acceptable and equally valuable. It's a matter of temperament, what you choose, become sugar or eat sugar. And according to Ramakrishna, various theistic and non-theistic religious paths are equally capable of leading to the salvific realization of the infinite divine reality. He conceives this divine reality, remember, that's the first tenet of his Vijnana Vedanta, expansively as both the impersonal non-dual absolute, Brahman, as well as the personal God, Shakti. Accordingly, his conception of the salvific goal of all religions is equally expansive. For non-theistic spiritual aspirants like Advaita Vedantins and Buddhists, salvation consists in the total dissolution of one's individuality in the non-dual reality. That's the paradigm of becoming sugar as the ideal. By contrast, for spiritual aspirants in theistic religions like Vaishnavism, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, salvation takes the form of eternal loving communion with the personal God, with or without form, in a transcendental realm. That is eating sugar rather than becoming sugar. Since there are various lokas, this is the Sanskrit term for transcendental realms, there are also multiple theistic forms of salvation. So it's not just that there's one theistic heaven, there are multiple theistic lokas for different souls. For instance, while devotees of Krishna can dwell eternally with their beloved Krishna in Vaikuntha Loka or in Goloka, Christians can dwell with Christ or God the Father in their Christian heaven. Muslims can commune with Allah in their eternal paradise called Jannah, I believe in Arabic, and so on. In short, Ramakrishna was not only a religious pluralist who held that different religious paths are equally capable of leading to salvation, but he was also what I would call a salvific pluralist, in that he held that salvation itself takes a variety of different forms, depending on the temperament and preferences of different souls. So one metaphor I like to use is the metaphor of a many-roomed mansion. I think of post-mortem salvation as a mansion, and different liberated souls can choose to inhabit whatever room in that mansion they choose. Now, every theory of religious pluralism faces a thorny problem, which philosophers of religion and theologians call the problem of conflicting religious truth claims. The problem is this: if different religions make conflicting claims about historical and metaphysical realities, then how can all religions be valid? So to give you just two examples, there's a historical question. Did Christ actually die on the cross? Christians say yes. Orthodox Christians at least say yes. And Islam, for instance, says no. So there's a direct conflict here. So how can both Christianity and Islam be true at the same time? That's a version of the problem. Another question, is reincarnation true? Well, the Orthodox Abrahamic religions say no, it's not true. But Hinduism and Buddhism say reincarnation is true, right? Or rebirth might be the better term used. Again, how can we affirm the equal validity of Hinduism and Buddhism on the one hand and Abrahamic religions on the other if they conflict directly about this question of whether there is rebirth or not? The key here to understanding the way that Ramakrishna handles this problem is that he did not claim that all religions are true, but that all religions are salvifically efficacious. There's a crucial difference here. He doesn't say that all the doctrines of all the religions are true. He says that even in spite of the errors of religion, they can still be equally capable of taking us to the goal of salvation. So that seems to me to be the key. Let me try to elaborate that a bit. And to help us, I found really useful the philosopher John Hick's classification of three different types of conflicting religious truth claims. The first type is disagreements about past historical events that are in principle accessible to human observation. For instance, the question, did Christ die on the cross, is a good example of number one. Number two, disagreements about trans-historical matters, which cannot be verified by historical or other empirical evidence. Hick himself said that rebirth falls into this category. But these days, there's more and more empirical evidence kind of piling up in support of rebirth. If you look at the work of Jim Tucker and Ian Stevenson, still many people don't think that that's sufficiently good empirical evidence. But it's a kind of open question whether you want to put the doctrine of reincarnation in two or not. And three, disagreements about ultimate questions. This is what Hick calls ultimate questions, such as the nature of ultimate reality. Is there a God? If so, what's the true nature of God? Can God incarnate in the form of human beings, and so on? So let's keep this in mind. And I think that Ramakrishna adopts one approach to disagreements regarding one and two, and he adopts a different approach to disagreements regarding three ultimate questions. So let's start with one and two. His stance on conflicting historical and trans-historical religious truth claims. According to Ramakrishna, historical and trans-historical doctrines are not vital for the attainment of salvation. This is a quotation of his. That yearning, vyakulata in Bangla, is the whole thing, yearning for God. Whatever path you follow, whether you are a Hindu, a Muslim, a Christian, a Shakta, a Vaishnava, or a Brahmo, the vital point is yearning. God is our inner guide, antaryami. It doesn't matter if you take a wrong path, only you must be restless for him. God himself will put you on the right path. Besides, there are errors in all paths. Everyone thinks his watch is right. But as a matter of fact, no watch is absolutely right, but that doesn't hamper one's work. So I think this is very significant. He says, no religion in this world has a monopoly on the truth. No religion is 100% true. Every religion has certain mistakes. So if rebirth is true, then Abrahamic religions are wrong about it. If Christ didn't die on the cross, then it means that Christianity is wrong about it and Islam is right about it. He says, in spite of these mistakes, the religions can still be salvifically efficacious. The key is for the spiritual aspirant to have a genuine longing for the divine reality in whatever form they like to think of him or her. I think he adopts an interestingly different stance on the third category that Hick talks about, disagreements about the nature of ultimate reality. From Ramakrishna's standpoint of Vijnana Vedanta, religious truth claims about the ultimate reality can turn out to be complementary rather than conflicting. So they're only apparently conflicting claims. And he uses the parable of the blind man and the elephant to illustrate this. Each religion captures a unique aspect or form of the impersonal, personal, infinite reality, but no religion captures the whole of the infinite reality. So I'll just read you this parable of the blind man and the elephant. One can rightly speak of God only after one has seen him. He who has seen God knows really and truly that God has form and that he is formless as well. He has many other aspects that cannot be described. Once some blind men chanced to come near an elephant. A person explained to them, this animal is an elephant. They were asked what the elephant was like. The blind men began to feel its body. One of them said the elephant was like a pillar. He had touched only its leg. Another said it was like a winnowing fan. He had touched only its ear. In this way, the others, having touched its tail or belly, gave their different versions of the elephant. Just so, a man who has seen only one aspect of God limits God to that alone. It is his conviction that God cannot be anything else. So I think this parable really nicely captures the idea that different religions capture different but equally real aspects of the same divine reality. So they can be complementary rather than conflicting. It's true that God incarnated as Christ, but it's also true that God is Allah. It's also true that God incarnated as Krishna, for instance. It's also true that God has an impersonal aspect, which Advaitins realize in the form of non-dual pure consciousness. And just to sum up, I think there are 4 key advantages of Ramakrishna's Vijnana-based doctrine of religious pluralism. 1, the major world religions are equally effective paths to realizing some aspect or form of one and the same impersonal, personal, infinite reality. So he doesn't get in this game of higher and lower that I think a lot of people discussing the world religions do get into. Second, since the personal God and the impersonal absolute are different but equally real aspects of one and the same infinite divine reality, theistic and non-theistic religions are placed on an equal ontological footing. And third, a very expansive view of salvation, instead of imposing a single narrow salvific goal onto all of the world religions, like some kind of monolithic conception of salvation, everybody attains the same kind of salvation. Ramakrishna teaches that a theist can dwell in an eternal heaven with the personal God in whatever form that liberated soul prefers, while an Advaitin can merge his or her individuality in non-dual pure consciousness. And fourth, Ramakrishna's broad conception of the impersonal, personal, infinite reality provides an ontological rationale for active interreligious dialogue. What I mean by this is this goes back to the previous slide about the third category of disagreements about the nature of ultimate reality. Since every religion has something true to say about the divine reality, we can learn more about God by exposing ourselves to religions other than our own. That's the idea behind 4. And there are other models of religious pluralism that aren't able to ground active interreligious learning in dialogue in the way that I think Ramakrishna's model lends itself to. I'm thinking of John Hick's model, and I discussed John Hick's religious pluralism in relation to Ramakrishna's in chapter 4 of my book, Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality. So if you're interested in that comparative study, please look at chapter 4. And now, as I promised, I want to discuss extremely briefly before concluding the influence of Sri Ramakrishna on the thinking of Sri Aurobindo. According to Sri Aurobindo, Sri Ramakrishna was the last and greatest of all the avatars. I mean, he made some very, very extreme statements, and this was in March 1908. He was the last and greatest of all the incarnations, avatars, for while others felt God in a single or limited aspect, he, Ramakrishna, felt God in his illimitable unity as the sum of an illimitable variety. In him, the spiritual experiences of the millions of saints who had gone before were renewed and united. Sri Ramakrishna gave to India the final message of Hinduism to the world. So you can see, I hope, how strongly influenced Sri Aurobindo was by Ramakrishna's life and teachings. He also, on an occult plane, a mystical plane in 1912, he claimed to have received 3 messages directly from Sri Ramakrishna. One of them, for instance, was, they're both Bengali, so they spoke Bangla with each other. Apparently, Sri Aurobindo claims that Sri Ramakrishna told him, Aurobindo, mundir koro, which means, Aurobindo, start your own ashrama, something along those lines. And Sri Aurobindo also said in a letter dated August 1912, to one of his followers, remember also that we derive from Ramakrishna. For myself, it was Ramakrishna who personally came and first turned me to this yoga. So I think this is a very striking statement. And notice that in the first bullet point here, that he's singling out Ramakrishna's ability to harmonize the different conceptions of God. So this is directly related, I think, to Ramakrishna's views on the harmony of religions, this idea of Vijnana, embracing both the personal and impersonal dimensions of God and the many different forms of God is equally true. And with regard to Aurobindo's, the influence of Swami Vivekananda, okay, so I have to give a little bit of context for Vivekananda. Swami Vivekananda was the chief monastic disciple of Sri Ramakrishna. And Vivekananda, obviously, I think most of you know this, but he traveled outside of India and he gave many lectures on Vedanta in the US and Europe. And he basically taught the message of Ramakrishna, the harmony of religions, but also kind of adapting Ramakrishna's message for a late 19th century context. And Sri Aurobindo studied Vivekananda's teachings as well. And again, he had also mystical encounters with Vivekananda. Sri Aurobindo claimed that when he was in jail for political activities, he wrote in this letter, dated August 1912, he said, Vivekananda in the Alipur jail in Kolkata gave me the foundations of that knowledge, which is the basis of our sadhana, spiritual practice. And he says, my contact with him, meaning Vivekananda, this is from a letter dated much later, 1934. My contact with Vivekananda was in the jail in Alipur when he was speaking with me for about 15 days, giving me the first insight into the intuition plane, not the intuitive mind, which is mental and not supramental, as the first opening to supermind. I think this is very useful because it's very precise, and Aurobindo himself is saying this. So I see Sri Aurobindo as saying that it was a combination of Ramakrishna and Vivekananda who gave him this first insight into what he calls the intuition plane, which is the first opening to supermind, which in turn is his English translation of Vijnana. He uses the term Vijnana himself frequently, and he often uses the term in the context of the Taittiriya Upanishad's fivefold scheme of the 5 different levels of consciousness. So it's the Vijnanamaya Atma. And remember, it seems to me that it's not at all a coincidence that Ramakrishna used the same term, Vijnana, to explain a very similar kind of spiritual experience. So I think that it's plausible to think that Ramakrishna's teachings on Vijnana influenced, or at least it's likely that they influenced Aurobindo's understanding of supermind and his own interpretation of the term Vijnana in scriptures like Taittiriya Upanishad. If you're interested in further details on Ramakrishna's views on religious pluralism, please look at chapters 3 and 4 of my previous book, Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality, published by Oxford in 2018. Chapter 3, I discuss Ramakrishna's views on religious pluralism in detail. In chapter 4, I bring him in a dialogue with John Hick. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks so much, Swamiji. It was a beautiful talk, very concise, and I see a lot of smiling people here. I'm sure full of questions. We have Jean-Michel, who's a student in the East West Psychology Department. Jean-Michel, why don't you start us off with a question?
Okay, thank you, Swamiji. That was really fantastic. My question is related to the fact that I've been studying some teachings of Ma Anandamoyi, and from my perspective, I found in her teachings a similar pluralism as the one you are describing with Ramakrishna. And I wanted to ask your opinion, and if you could talk a little bit about that.
Well, you'd have to tell me more about her views because I don't know anything about them.
Well, she was receiving people from all kinds of different religions, even Christian people. Many French people came to her, and she was very clear on the fact that people should just stay in their own religion and follow their own path in their own religion. You know, with their personal ishta belonging to that religion, and that will equally lead them to the supreme realization.
Right. No, that's great. I mean, yeah. So that does sound similar to Ramakrishna. I think the rub is in the details, and we'd have to look at. I don't know. I mean, I don't know whether her teachings have been recorded and kind of systematized or whatever. But I think a lot of people say that, but when you push them on exactly how they justify the equal validity, the equal salvific efficacy of different religions, sometimes they
Well,
run into
she
trouble.
was
Yeah.
teaching different disciplines. Like she was
Right.
not teaching only Jnana Yoga. She was teaching
Yeah,
Jnana Yoga
sure.
to Jnana
Yeah.
Yogi. She was teaching devotional
Right.
fast. She was teaching
No, what I mean, I
even
think you
Hatha Yoga.
I think, yeah, no, what I'm saying is, does she have an underlying philosophical framework to ground that kind of religious pluralism?
Yeah, well, she's not a philosopher.
Right. Well, a lot of people say Ramakrishna wasn't either. So that's why part of the task of my previous book was to argue that he was not just a mystic, but also a philosopher on the basis of his teachings. And so it would be interesting. It would be an interesting research project to see whether one can kind of reconstruct Anandamayi's teachings as a kind of systematic philosophy of some sort. I think it can be done in the case of other saints who are often dismissed as non-philosophical. I tried doing that in the case of Ramakrishna. Thank you very much.
I could feel the question here from Sarah, which came up somewhere in the middle. How does longing or yearning relate with desire in Ramakrishna's vision?
Yeah, I think it's just the difference is just in the object. And so if you desire God, that's longing in the sense that in the relevant sense. But if you desire worldly things, then that's to be avoided. That should be renounced, right? In order to develop this true yearning for God. As Christ said, you can choose God or mammon, but not both. So without renouncing the one, desire for worldly things, you cannot have this true desire for God. That's how I see things. I think that's the Vedantic picture. I think Sri Aurobindo would agree with that as well.
It's interesting you said it depends on the object, because I would see the other layer of it, kind of the division between what's objective and material, as being that which is the desire, as you're stating in these traditions, and to objectify God would, in a sense, kind of, place him in a fallen position with the rest of that material world, which in other traditions like panpsychist ones or very natural philosophical traditions is kind of more of the ideal. Right.
Okay, I think it depends on how you understand object, but I wouldn't push it too hard. I mean, I think, remember, going back to Ramakrishna's analogy of eating sugar versus becoming sugar, if the bhakta just is one with God, you can't revel with God, you can't play with God, you can't be united with God in a loving relationship. That's why they maintain distance, right? So you can still, so I think Sri Aurobindo, for instance, is a good example of somebody, if you look at the Life Divine, of somebody who embraces a kind of radical Advaita, not practical Advaita, but a kind of what he calls a realistic Advaita. It's an Advaita in the sense that there's only one reality, which is the divine reality. But that divine reality has a capacity for dynamism. And so that divine reality can manifest in the form of the personal God. And there are real individual souls that can commune in various kinds of loving relationships with the real personal God, even within what you're calling the panpsychist framework. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, that's why I made a joke earlier about processed sugar. It was like a joke on processed philosophy. That
Oh, okay.
No, absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, process philosophy is interesting. I'm friends with Jeffrey Long. I don't know how many of you have heard of him, but he's done some work on Ramakrishna in relation to process philosophy. The only thing I don't see in process, I mean, there are a few things, but one of them I don't think that they have the equivalent of Nirguna Brahman. I don't think Whitehead and Hartshorne have the idea of Nirguna Brahman, the non-dual pure consciousness in the relevant sense, in Shankara sense, whereas Ramakrishna fully embraces the impersonal dimension of the absolute. Yeah, thanks.
Swamiji, is on the bhakti path, is there a commensurate experience to the experience of the kind of non-dual or transcendent nirgun, or is there always kind of, like a ras or an experience that separates each individual experience?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Sri Ramakrishna's take on this is just that because God is omnipotent and gracious, God can choose to give bhaktas the knowledge of non-dual Brahman just by his grace. Bhaktas, without even practicing the Advaitic path, can attain the realization of Brahman. So bhaktas leave it up to God, right? So that's kind of, that's their approach. And so if God wants to give them the knowledge of Brahman, they can give them the knowledge of Brahman. That's the way I see it, at least from Ramakrishna's standpoint. Yeah, Sri Aurobindo is an interesting case, right? Because his first spiritual experience, as far as I'm aware, was when he was training under Vishnu Bhaskar Lele, who was studying meditation or practicing meditation under Lele. And in 3 days, he had this kind of nirvikalpa samadhi, and he later claimed that was the Advaitic realization of non-dual Brahman. And I looked upon the world as a cinematographic play of vacant forms superimposed on the impersonal Brahman, Sadatman. And then in jail, he had this further, what I consider to be Ramakrishna's Vijnana kind of experience. Because he says that in jail, he saw everything as Vasudeva. He had a beautiful speech, the Uttarpada speech, where he says, I saw everybody and everything as Vasudeva. The coarse blankets that were covering me were Vasudeva. The prison grating was Vasudeva. The prisoners, the murderers, the swindlers, all Vasudeva. So that's quite striking. So he had multiple forms of these spiritual experiences, very much like Ramakrishna, Jnana and Vijnana.
So can it be in that case that even choosing to have a family and kids might be also perceived by one eventually as a manifestation of God instead of being an either or? Because if I hadn't, I think that you were saying that before. I don't know. I've never read anything about Sri Ramakrishna, so departing from full ignorance.
Yeah, no, you notice that I said worldliness rather than the world. So I don't think that Ramakrishna said you have to renounce the world. He said you have to renounce worldliness, and you can be married and renounce worldliness, and you can be a monk and still be very worldly. So, and so there, I think Ramakrishna and Sri Aurobindo really are at one.
I'm asking,
but one thing I'll mention though is that it's easier said than done for householders, for monks as well. But it's very easy to deceive yourself in spiritual life. This is something I talk about a lot because self-deception is one of these. So you do everything and you enjoy everything, and then you say, "But I'm doing it on a spiritual basis," or "That's my spiritual partner." And one has to be very careful and try not to deceive oneself. Try to be brutally honest with oneself on the spiritual path. I think that's important.
No, I was thinking about that because a long time ago I read a book. I think that it was a Grass Jewels of Knowledge, in which Shankara meets with this very prominent man, and he is a householder, and they begin to discuss what's a better path, if the house life, the household life, or the life of a monk. And the wife of this man becomes the judge. And after the whole argument, he realizes that Shankara is correct. And so he leaves his wife, and his wife is completely okay because she has been the judge of this. And I've always had a conflict with that. I understand that having a family takes away and distracts a lot. But on the other side, I mean, the insights that can come, you know, and that's why when I began to learn from Sri Aurobindo, where he joins Tantra and Vedanta, I found, well, maybe this is a new path.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think the thing to keep in mind is that we're all on different paths, and that, what might be right for me would not be right for you, possibly. And the reason is because there's a many life paradigm, right? And I'm sure I married in a previous life, which saved me from marriage in this life, right? So it's not that I didn't learn my experiences from marriage. Presumably I did so in a previous life, right? Yeah. And it might be that you're going to be a monk in a future life or none, right? Depending on what gender you are and whatever. Yeah.
Just curious, isn't even if someone doesn't acknowledge a spiritual life, isn't from the moment they are born, they're in a spiritual life, whether they acknowledge it or not, whether they even go towards any kind of open spirituality or religion or not, from the time of birth into physical form, they're in a spiritual life, whether they would acknowledge that or not. Is that a thought?
Yeah, I think everything depends on what spiritual life means. And Sri Aurobindo has a statement, all life is yoga. I think it's a profound statement. And, what does yoga mean? I think it means any practice that brings us closer to God. And in that sense, literally everything, whether we kill somebody or whether we, engage in, high-level spiritual practices, is bringing us closer to God in a certain sense. Because if we do something bad, we learn from our bad experiences and try to be better people. When we do something good, we're becoming more sattvic and we're coming closer to God. So I think that Sri Aurobindo meant that even in the midst of our dumbest, stupidest, worst experiences, worst deeds, we're still in a certain sense learning from it. Whether we're consciously learning from it or whether we're being forced to learn from it just through the sheer suffering. Like, I know cases of people on their deathbed through cancer who come to these realizations about life through that terrible experience of suffering. So Vivekananda used to say, suffering is the great eye-opener. It's because it's sometimes only suffering, even if we're completely unconscious, it's suffering that wakes us up, right? It opens our eyes. Yeah, thank you.
Right. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and that idea seems to come from the kind of the monistic basis, in a sense. All is one, and I guess there is a question here. I'll just get to that in a sec too. But like that, almost like the linking principle between the pluralism, like the monistic ontology, the metaphysics, and how that links into this kind of radical pluralism. And yeah, there's the infinite paths to God. And I was going to ask about, like, there would be infinite yogas in a way. You know, and Sri Aurobindo would say there's as many yogas as there are people, in a sense. Like, you know,
I think he either he came up with that on his own or he read that in Vivekananda, because Vivekananda said something very similar. Vivekananda said, it's just a historical fact that every religion has ultimately split into different sects. And then Vivekananda says, that's a wonderful thing. Would that sects would multiply until every individual had his or her own sect. And in a similar vein, he would say that no person is born into a religion. Each person has an individualized religion in the depths of his or her soul. So the first step in spiritual life is discovering what that individualized religion is, and then you can make the most rapid spiritual progress.
And I'll read this question here from Rebecca. This is a wiki quote. According to Sri Aurobindo, full yogic development consists of two parts: the standard yogic goal of ascent into a formless and timeless self, and the descent and establishment of the supramental consciousness into earthly life. Through integral yoga, one actualizes the supermind. The supramental consciousness transforms the entire being and leads to the divinization of the material world. What is supramental consciousness? And I guess I would add also, can you relate that to the Ishvara Koti, that idea of Ramakrishna?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, first of all, the wiki quote, I would just like modify it a little bit, because I wouldn't say that there are two parts. I think usually the way that Sri Aurobindo puts it is there are at least three stages. And the first is a psychic awakening, where you realize yourself as a psychic being separate from the body-mind complex. You realize yourself as an eternal soul, which is the child of God. Next realization is something like the realization of the Atman, the impersonal Atman, Advaitic realization. And then there's the divine descent, which corresponds to this second phase here in the wiki quote. And yes, I think that Ramakrishna's teachings on Vijnana I think they partly inspired Sri Aurobindo to develop this philosophy of the supramental, of supermind, because I think Ramakrishna's Vijnana is the supermind. And I think Sri Aurobindo just, kind of pushed that further and kind of further developed that idea. So I think there's a direct connection there. And remember that Aurobindo himself credited Vivekananda, who was the chief disciple of Sri Ramakrishna, with teaching him about the intuition plane, which is the opening to none other than supermind, right? So I mean, it's all, I think, connected quite nicely.
And that supramental consciousness, how does that relate to the Ishvara Koti? And what can you maybe just describe for everybody, like, what that is? And
okay, sorry, yeah, I guess I didn't talk about it in the presentation. So Sri Ramakrishna distinguishes two categories of soul, jiva. One is what he calls the jiva koti, by which he means the ordinary soul, people who come to this world because they have karma, which forces them to come back in a physical body. And then he says there's other category, this elite, spiritual elite, which he calls the category of Ishvara Kotis, and he defines Ishvara Koti very precisely as avatars and portions of an avatara. So divine incarnations and those who come as parts or portions of an incarnation. Avatar is angsho in Bengali. These people don't come to this world because of their own karmic propensities, but in order to help others. and to help divinize the world in Sri Aurobindo's terms. And so one question that comes up in the context of Ramakrishna is everybody capable of attaining the state of Vijnana? And I think his answer was usually no, because not everybody is an Ishvara Koti. And he would usually say that only Ishvara Kotis are capable of attaining the state of Vijnana. But one way of looking at the kind of development, the spiritual lineage from Ramakrishna to Vivekananda and then to Sri Aurobindo is that one can see Swami Vivekananda and Sri Aurobindo as kind of democratizing or universalizing Sri Ramakrishna's state of Vijnana, the teachings on Vijnana, and saying that, I mean, this is like from a kind of devotee standpoint, but one can say that with the advent of the Ramakrishna incarnation, the state of Vijnana, which is only open to a spiritual elite, has now been universalized. And both Vivekananda and Sri Aurobindo are kind of in that flow and trying to kind of explore the universalistic implications of Ramakrishna's teachings on Vijnana.
That's super clear. Thank you. That makes a lot of sense to me. And it seems to also bring out the ethical, the political, the ethical aspects of this divinization of the earth, beyond, I guess, pluralism of religion, for instance. So I was just wondering how you see that, like in terms of, and also I guess the metaphysical basis. What does it need to fundamentally change in a sense, and like that monism is now accessible to all? The linking principle, the Vijnana is it's not something that's just in a certain incarnation, but it's through the psychic being, for instance, in Sri Aurobindo's case, it would be present in all beings, all things.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the idea is what Sri Aurobindo was trying, which is that bringing down that supramental consciousness so that everybody, or at least not everybody, I don't think he ever said that everybody will attain supermind, but that many can and will, right? And that's the work that I think has yet to be done. I mean, Sri Aurobindo didn't complete it, and then the mother kind of continued his project, and I think that there's some controversy about how far she went. And there are a lot of questions among the disciples about exactly how much further that project needs to be taken. But I think that it's really a project started by Ramakrishna and then kind of furthered by Swami Vivekananda and then Aurobindo and now his followers, I think.
Well, and yourself too, are you involved in the conversation? I mean, your other work involves cosmopsychism, that concept. I mean, somebody mentioned panpsychism. Do you want to, can you open up a little bit to some of your other work and how cosmopsychism maybe is coming into your work, and maybe you could speak.
Yeah, I mean, that would be like a separate lecture. So, but I can say briefly, but yeah, so cosmopsychism is a position in contemporary philosophy of mind, which means that it's a form of panpsychism, which somebody mentioned earlier. Panpsychism means that everything is consciousness. Cosmopsychism is the view that there's only one consciousness. And that's what they call cosmic consciousness. Or in the case of Sri Aurobindo, I think Sri Aurobindo defended a distinctively theistic is not the right word, but a religious form or spiritual form of cosmopsychism. So he understood that one consciousness, that all-pervading consciousness as divine consciousness, Satchitananda. And I think that his cosmopsychist theory really makes a valuable contribution to contemporary discussions about consciousness. David Chalmers is a major contemporary philosopher at New York University who coined this phrase, the hard problem of consciousness. And the hard problem is that we can understand everything about the brain and brain states. We can even map correlations between brain states and different states of consciousness. That still leaves open this question of why in the world are we conscious at all? And how do we account for that first person quality of conscious states, the taste of coffee, the pain of getting hit in the knee. And no materialist explanation of consciousness, any explanation of consciousness that reduces conscious states to something material, can answer that hard problem, can solve that hard problem of consciousness. So that's why in contemporary philosophy, many philosophers who don't have a spiritual bone in their body are now starting to consider cosmopsychism as a potentially attractive solution to the hard problem of consciousness, because you don't have to explain consciousness anymore if that's what's fundamental. And that is Sri Aurobindo's, that's also Ramakrishna's and Vivekananda's worldview. There's nothing but consciousness manifesting in different forms, right? That's a very short summary. But
Yeah, thank you. Beautiful. I've just noticed Rebecca has a follow-up question here. So the supermind is more in the body than outside the body.
oh, I mean, yeah, I don't know how to answer that question. I mean, I don't know. It's divine. I mean, the supermind is divine. I think it's both in and out of the body. Maybe would be the answer, but I'm not sure. Yeah.
Almost like spiritualizing matter. It would be matter itself.
Yeah, eventually, right? But that was part of that project that I think has yet to be completed. The immortalization of every cell in the human body, right? I don't think we've reached that point yet. I don't think anybody has. Yeah.
Swamiji, I'm wondering if there are intimations of this in Ramakrishna's work. It seems this kind of evolutionary view of this is something that arises in the wake of Darwin, but it's obviously there in Sri Aurobindo's work. But I'm just a beginner with Sri Ramakrishna, but I haven't really kind of seen that.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, the one thing I would recommend you look at in the gospel is when he's talking about Vikyana, in the context is significant. He also brings in this concept in Bengali. It's anulom vilom. The Sanskrit terms are anuloma viloma, which are involution and evolution. So that I think is the most direct connection with Sri Aurobindo's, and he read his teachings very carefully. He kept the dust of Dakshineshwar, where Sri Ramakrishna lived, in his room in Pondicherry. And Vivekananda, if you look up the complete works, if you do a keyword search on the online version, involution and evolution are terms that he uses constantly. Vivekananda. And the last two chapters of my new book, Swami Vivekananda's Vedanta Cosmopolitanism, I won't show it now, are on Vivekananda's cosmopsychism. I see Sri Aurobindo as further developing Ramakrishna's and Vivekananda's cosmopsychism very consciously, because he was influenced by both of them.
And Sarah has a question here in the chat. Does cosmopsychism loop back around to pantheistic monism, such as in Spinoza? Do we loop from the pantheist to panentheist to panpsychist back into a novel form of pantheism?
Okay, I mean, I don't consider Sri Aurobindo or Sri Ramakrishna or Swami Vivekananda to be pantheists. I consider them all to be panentheists. For those of you who may not be familiar with the terminology, pantheism typically means God is the world, but nothing over and above the world. God just is the world. And panentheism says, yes, the world is God, but God is also beyond the world. So God is both immanent, and transcendent. And I think all three of these figures, Sri Ramakrishna, Swami Vivekananda, and Sri Aurobindo, were panentheists in that sense. And so I describe Swami Vivekananda's cosmopsychism as a panentheistic cosmopsychism. And I think one can say the same thing about Sri Aurobindo. I call it an evolutionary cosmopsychism, but one can equally call it an evolutionary panentheistic cosmopsychism, but that would be too much of a mouthful. So I chose one, evolutionary rather than panentheistic. Yeah. So I don't necessarily see it that way. I see these terms are not mutually exclusive. At least panpsychism and panentheism are not mutually exclusive. And I see all three of these figures, Sri Ramakrishna, Swami Vivekananda, and Sri Aurobindo, as endorsing a panentheistic form of panpsychism, namely cosmopsychism.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I enjoyed learning about Spinoza, and there are some people interpret him in like questioning the pantheism and saying maybe panentheist, but it's really interesting because when you get into experience, if experience is driving these frameworks and metaphysics, and mystical experience takes you to the kind of the outside or some kind of radically altered state of consciousness that's not really integratable into your habitual and your normal self in a way. It's interesting because it's like, well, is there a cut? Is that a transcendence that cuts outside of nature itself, or is it just another part of what's already connected in a sense? Is it just a folding? Like Deleuze is going to get into talking about folding. Is it just the inside of the outside, or things like that? So it's an interesting question to think about. I guess all of these thinkers, in terms of yes, there is a kind of a transcendence, and there is in these traditions a transcendent, but it's hard to for me, I don't know, it's hard to settle on. Is it how do we really know if there's a radical break here or not? Do you have thoughts along this? Not a clear question, but it's sort of a grappling of mine.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure what the question is, but if from what I gather, I mean, one thing I'll just say is that one impulse I resist is the impulse to say that what Spinoza said, Aurobindo is now saying, and that's what I'm.
Yeah.
Like I try to be careful about kind of honoring the uniqueness and the specificity of each thinker and each spiritual figure. There can certainly be points of overlap, but I think in certain traditions, I think people are over eager to kind of say that everybody's saying the same thing, and I resist that impulse in general. Yeah.
I think
that there are distinctive elements in Sri Aurobindo's work, which I don't think you find in Ramakrishna and Vivekananda. That's also significant.
Sorry to go into.
Yes, Sarah, go.
And sorry, I don't have my camera on. I'm so tired. I think this is just kind of another part of that differentiation, though, between the pluralistic and the monistic, and kind of, you know, I see it as another layer of needing to balance both of those together into its own non-dual state, you know, and it's just kind of infinitely like that. But if you're going to see them separately as two totally different traditions or like evolutions of a tradition, then you have to keep weighing like which path. They're both right? Like they're both, that's where panentheism kind of bridges to the transcendent and the immanent with that. But sorry, I'm kind of losing what I was going to say.
So I didn't, wait, what is the both here? I didn't understand the both paths. What are the two paths you're talking
about? Of the monistic and the pluralistic that you have like as headlining your discussion.
I see. Actually, I mean, that was Jonathan's title. I mean, yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, what you're kind of talking about, where like you want to pay respect to everybody as an individual and as an artist and create their own vision, and be careful about, you know, making the synchronicity. But I think that's kind of where we're pulled like to in the spiritual and transcendent kind of path, like. It's collective and individual at the same time, right? Like it's this whole nuclear atomic philosophy in the long run. And we want to be careful, but it is also kind of like that spiritual apex to have everybody kind of coming together in the vision. So I'm fascinated by both of them. Like I think finding these connections between thinkers all over the world, it's kind of like a big reason that this school even exists.
No, I'm not discouraging that work. I just think we should be very careful to honor differences as well as similarities.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I was just kind of saying it like fits perfectly just into this, you know, what we consider this differentiation between the monistic and pluralistic, and how they're in their own marriage together.
Yeah. Thank you, Sarah.
Yeah. Thanks, Sarah. Anybody else who hasn't spoken? We have a couple more minutes here with Swamiji, who has another lecture to get to. So we will we'll maybe break in a couple minutes, but I just want to keep some space for people who haven't had a chance to say anything. Stefan, do you have final words?
No, just thank you. You know, we enjoyed a conversation with Swamiji that's going to be released in one of our podcasts. So it was nice to see you again, and nice to get a chance to chat with you again.
Likewise, thank you, and thank you everyone for the excellent questions.
Please come back.
Thank you.
Yes, thanks you so much, Swamiji. And yeah, this is a long, ongoing conversation. It's so important and fascinating, and I think you really appreciate your work at our school, for sure. I know.
Thanks,
I do.
Jonathan.
So.
Could you please send me the piece that you performed, the full version of it, if there's a link or something, or an MP3? I'd appreciate that.
In the beginning?
Yeah, was that like a small part of a larger piece, or what?
That was the raga called Bhairavi, and it's
so do you have the full performance of that? Could you send that?
I've never recorded that one yet.
Oh, okay. Well, you got to do that for me, and then you can.
I will. I'll make one for you. It's actually the raga that kind of traditionally embodies the mother consciousness. And as I was thinking about you coming on, and thinking about Dakshineshwar and being in Bengal, and that was the mood that came. So
today happens to be the birthday of Holy Mother Sharada Devi, the wife of Sri Ramakrishna. So it's very appropriate.
Oh my gosh, beautiful.
Yes. So thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for being here.
Om.